This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
He is Dinesh D'Souza. He is a giant on the right, an extremely long-time successful conservative author, filmmaker, a host of the Dinesh D'Souza podcast. Follow him on Twitter. Check out his podcast. Dinesh, first off, thank you so much, my friend. It's good to see you.
It's a real pleasure, Joe. This is the kind of conversation that, quite honestly, doesn't occur a whole lot today.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
Agreed.
Gone are the days when I was invited to CNN, and gone are the days when you'd have Crossfire and those sorts of things. And I think it's kind of a pity.
Yeah.
I'm hoping that we'll be able to demonstrate that we can have a real conversation and disagree, but also maybe find a few areas of agreement.
Amen, my friend. Exactly right. And it won't surprise you that I've heard from many people who now follow me on the left who just can't believe I'd sit down with you. And I very respectfully tell them I'm sitting down with anybody. So this is important. Hey, I want to start with the broad topic of January 6th, obviously with what Tucker did last week, very much in the news again. And Dinesh, I have a very selfish motivation here. Like you, I want to find out if you and I have any common ground on January 6th. So I want to start out by throwing just a very broad question at you. I'll answer it first, and then I'll give the floor to you. In your mind, Dinesh, what was January 6th? My short answer has always been January 6th was a violent attempt to overthrow an American election led by people who believe that election was stolen. When you're asked that broad question, Dinesh, what was January 6th? What's your answer?
My answer is that January 6th was a primal scream of protest from the right about what was widely perceived by the protesters as a stolen election. Now, we can get to the question of whether it was stolen, whether they were right, or whether they were not. But these primal screams are actually customary on the left. We see them all over the place. We obviously saw them in spades and times 100, I would say, in the aftermath of the George Floyd incident. And we see them in miniature occurring, day by day. I mean, there was recently an Antifa attack on University of California at Davis. A few days prior, a judge was shouted, down with the dean's complicity at Stanford Law School. So the left has these primal screams all the time against some sort of perceived injustice. Well, here there was a perceived injustice. And I think what really frustrated the January 6th guys was they're not sort of enmeshed in American politics in the procedural or kind of mechanistic way that you and I are. They're not creatures of DC. They look and see, we think this election is prima facie stolen, and we don't see anybody even looking at it. There are courts, but the courts appear to be just doing procedural gymnastics. In other words, you're bringing the case too late. You should have brought it before the election. But when it was brought before the election, you're bringing it too early. There's been no malfeasance. So I think people thought, wait a minute, surely this is going to be looked at by somebody, if not the courts. If they're too scared to do it, maybe the legislature will. And so anyway, you got all these guys, and it's, as you know, a large group of people who came to the Trump rally. In my view, the vast majority of these people were in no way dangerous. They were completely peaceful. Even of the guys who went into the Capitol, the vast majority were nonviolent. They made no violent effort to take over the government. Not one of them brought any arms with them. How do you have a violent insurrection with your body, with a flagpole? I mean, look at the actual video and believe your eyes. Look at the shaman guy. He's prancing around like an idiot. He's obviously mentally not like 100% there. He's not trying to take over Nancy Pelosi's position. He thinks it's fun to sit in her seat, maybe, and take a selfie.
Let me stop you there, Dinesh.
Yeah, sure.
As you go down that road, because you're raising some interesting points, and without addressing any of the other primal screams, you call January 6th the primal scream. Even using that definition, was it a good? Apologies if this is too broad of a question. Was it a good or a bad thing to do for people to demonstrate a primal scream by breaking into the Capitol? Like, was that a good or a bad thing that they did that?
It's a bad thing. Look, I do not approve of anybody, pushing their way into the Capitol, not especially when there is a proceeding underway. Now, look, again, part of the problem here, Joe, is that these are the same people who look and see, if you just run the tape back, the Kavanaugh affair, where you got these people at the Supreme Court. They're on the left. They're using obvious battering tactics to kind of push their way in. Even at Trump's inauguration, 2016, look at all the violence that broke out in D.C. And then people see that, look, this appears to be an all-American tradition. Some of these guys get misdemeanors, some of these guys get arrested overnight, but then they boast about it the next morning. So you have to set the environment in which people are acting. They're not acting in a vacuum, like, listen, there's a sacrosanct rule that you shouldn't go into the Capitol. The left has no such rule. They would not hesitate to do this if the exact circumstances were switched. They would go into the Capitol,
but you'd
they would do
acknowledge
exactly what the conservatives did, and they would get away with it.
Dinesh, you'd acknowledge, though, that entering the Capitol and remaining in the Capitol broke the law. Like that, you and I may disagree with that law, but that broke the law.
Yes, I agree with that. Again, Joe, honestly, you're a lawyer. Context is important, right?
I'm not a lawyer, for the record. I'm not. No, that's okay.
You're not a lawyer. Okay. Well, the context is important. You're breaking into the Capitol, but for what purpose? I mean, this is really the key question. I think this may be where we disagree. You think that they were trying to somehow either overthrow or take over the government, correct?
Overthrow the election, stop the official certification of the election. Yes.
Okay, but again, with what end? When you say stop the certification, there is a process going on. Let's say that they wanted to stop it. It could go two ways, right? They are like Mussolini. They don't want the process to occur at all. They're anti-democratic. They want to use force to somehow occupy the Capitol. In other words, they are trying to cancel the election. That's one thing. I would submit that's not what they were trying to do. What they were trying to do is something quite different, right? What they were trying to do is they believed, and we can come to the merits of it again, they believed that the states are where these elections need to be certified, and the states have every authority, if they want, to do audits or recounts, and all that they wanted is they wanted Mike Pence to authorize the states to take another look at what happened in the 2020 election. So however,
no, and even Dinesh, even if I accept that, that could be a part of it, but they then wanted the official certification in Congress that day to be stopped, to return it to the states or whatever. But when I tell you, Dinesh, when I say that the people who violently broke into the Capitol, the vast majority of them, especially the vast majority of those who were arrested, some over 1,000 now, in their own testimony, in their own pleadings, they said why they were there. They wanted to stop the certification. Some said they wanted to overthrow the election. In their own words, that's what they said when they were arrested and or pled guilty.
Well, first of all, I think I've seen some of those pleadings. I also know
That's in their own words.
someone who somewhat unfortunately has been through this process.
Yeah.
I got to tell you a little bit of how it works. Okay, so in my own case, which is I'm only citing because it's illuminating how this stuff works. In my own case, I gave $20,000 over the campaign finance limit to my friend Wendy Long, who's running for the Senate. I should have done it. Did I break the law? Yes, I did. Normally, this is not even prosecuted. Where it is prosecuted, they always look to see, is there some quid pro quo? Is Dinesh trying to be appointed a federal judge? In this case, no. Wendy had virtually no chance to win. I didn't even tell her I did it. So the point is, normally it's a slap on the wrist, some community service. But sitting across from the SDNY, the Southern District of New York lawyers, they're like, hey, listen, if you don't plead guilty, we're going to get you on bank fraud. I'm like, bank fraud? They're like, because you took your money from the bank. And then they go, we'll add a charge of mail fraud. I go, mail fraud? They go, yeah, because you put your check in the mail. And I'm like, you're redescribing the same thing I did multiple ways. And you're threatening me now with years in prison because you know that I can't afford to have my life ruined in this way. So you're bludgeoning me into taking a plea. And so you're going to make me sign things. So this is how plea bargaining works. And that's the system, right? And I don't think it's a good system, but nevertheless, you can get people to agree to things. I mean, they even got January 6 defendants to agree to let the government listen into their conversation with lawyers. Now, would any reasonable person agree to that?
So I hear your concern on the pleadings. When I look at the numbers, Dinesh, I mean, well over 1,000 people have been arrested. Over 500 pled guilty. Almost 60 were found guilty in trial. Over 300 people were found guilty of assaulting police officers. 200 people have been sentenced to prison. Over 100 people were found guilty of criminally obstructing an official proceeding. It's interesting, Dinesh, you bring up, I think earlier you brought up weapons. Again, in the court documents and the pleadings, in both, there was evidence of tasers, tomahawk axes, crowbars, flagpoles, baseball bats, chemical sprays, knives, and firearms on people who entered the Capitol and in people's possession outside the Capitol. There were weapons there as well. Again, according to the official court documents.
Yeah, so let's look at that a little more carefully. Number one, some of there are these sort of, I would call them, I don't know what the right term is, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, but these are guys who I would call it the right's answer to Antifa, okay? And I don't approve, by the way, of any of this, but it is true that when Antifa shows up, the Proud Boys show up, these guys start scuffling and punching each other. And my understanding is that in these cases, the Proud Boys came and they brought some of their stuff. They didn't bring weapons, but they brought some of their fighting gear because they expected Antifa to show up and they expected there to be a confrontation. Number two, now,
Dinesh, to address number one before you go to number two, you're right. Clearly, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, they seem to be the more violent folks. In fact, two of the Proud Boys, or maybe the Oath Keepers, were found guilty of seditious conspiracy, literally trying to overthrow the government. But the court document showed that when it comes to weapons, there were weapons on, hundreds of people who entered the Capitol or were outside the Capitol, well beyond just the Proud Boys. But continue.
Well, first of all, there is not a single defendant who has been charged with bringing any kind of weapon into the Capitol.
They haven't been charged with it, yes.
Right. And that's because they didn't. If they were, you could be sure they would be charged, right? I mean, you've got people charged for putting out memes about January 6th. So the numbers don't impress me because of the absurdity of the charges. There are people, let's take Dr. Simone Gold. Now, Dr. Simone Gold is actually a kind of COVID activist. She has nothing to do with election fraud or anything like that. She was invited to give a speech. She goes down to D.C. She shows up at the place where she's giving a speech, and that place is closed. and she's pointed by someone in authority, go over this way, go over there, go speak over there. So she marches away. She sees a crowd heading toward the Capitol. She sees uniformed policemen on both sides doing nothing. Now, if you or I are in a museum, just to take how ordinary people see this stuff, and you see a wing, and let's say there's a wing of the museum that says, don't enter or under construction, and there's a guy sitting there, and you walk past him, you're like, I wonder what's in that room. And the guy doesn't go, hey, listen, you can't go in there, leave now. To me, what's really striking about January 6th is the complete absence of any announcements, anyone saying to the people in the Capitol, leave now. And I would venture to bet that the vast majority of them would have left because it was not their intention to occupy the Capitol. They certainly weren't under the illusion that if let's just say, for example, they were successful. Let's say there was no security. Let's say that the shaman guy stayed in the Capitol. What do you think he would do? Make himself president? Take over the government, make laws? No. I mean, they were staging a protest, and they knew, as well as anybody else, the Capitol's going to be surrounded. There are going to be people with riot shields. They're going to be told, get out of here. They'd have to leave. So this is why I think that the idea that this is some sort of insurrection is just, linked to the Civil War, linked to the occupation of 1812. I mean, you don't fall for that kind of ridiculousness, do you?
No, I think, well, again, Dinesh, what I keep falling back on is in their own words, in their own testimony, what they pled guilty to, what they were found guilty of. And of all of these people arrested, again, in their own words, the vast majority said they were there to stop this official proceeding. Now, I can't argue with you about what their grand plan was or how sophisticated it was, but they broke into the Capitol and rioted into the Capitol to stop an official government proceeding, in their own words. I mean, that's serious stuff, right? No matter how incompetent they were.
Yeah, look, I mean, the proceeding, as it so happens, was postponed by about 6 hours. Now, if you're asking me, were there violent people in January 6th? Yes. Should they be dealt with harshly or according to the law? Yes. Now, again, when I look at those situations, I apply a rule of proportionality. Proportionality is key to our justice system because it means that people who break the law should be treated equivalently. In other words, if you're caught speeding and you get a $100 ticket and I'm caught speeding and I get a year in prison, there's no proportionality. That's absurd because other people who do the same sort of thing don't get the same sort of penalty. So in my view, look, let me just take a single case, which I think is pretty typical. Okay, here's a guy. I happen to just pull the record on this. This is a case from 2020. It's a post-George Floyd rioter. His name is Dakota Horton. Here's this case. He was arrested in August of 2020 for assault of a federal police officer. Okay? Now, this is a sentence that normally carries a very severe penalty, up to 20 years. However, he's released almost immediately. No solitary confinement, no waiting for a year and a half. In other words, not being locked up until his trial occurs. When his trial does occur, the prosecution basically goes, well, what you did is 24 months. We're going to give you 24 months. We're going to ask the judge for 24 months, and the judge agrees. So here you've got a violent assault on law enforcement. And I only cite this case because there are like hundreds of these. And now you match them up against some grandma who literally is following a crowd, finds herself in the Capitol, and looks around bewildered, doesn't deface anything, doesn't destroy any property, doesn't harm anybody, is completely unarmed, is incapable of doing anybody harm. But
Dinesh, don't match that Dakota dude from 20 up against some grandma who strolled into the Capitol. Match it up against one of the January 6th defendants who assaulted a cop. There were plenty of those, hundreds of those.
So there was a guy, for example, who bear sprayed Officer Sicknick. Now, I think
Yeah.
you'll agree, based on what we know now, that Sicknick died of natural causes. The idea that that the Trumpsters killed him is not true. However, there was apparently a scuffle. There were two guys. I think the guy's name was Julian Cater. I'm not entirely sure. But in any event, and by the way, it's not like the cops weren't using their shields and their truncheons. This guy whips out some bear spray and sprays, and they're looking at 71 months. Now, again, proportionality. In a scuffle with a crowd, something that you could easily imagine happening to a left-wing protester at the Kavanaugh protest. The cops kind of bear down on him. He whips out some spray, sprays the cops. Is he going to get 71 months? I think you know as well as I do, no. In fact, that guy is lucky to spend unlucky to spend 2 days in prison for that, because cops assume that that's just left-wing agitation.
You're not. Oh, I get you, Dinesh, and I hear your issue with the equality here of these cases, and I'm going to agree with you with some of that. Whether you assault a cop out in Minneapolis or a cop in Santa Fe or a cop inside the Capitol, you assault a cop, you ought to pay. And you pepper spray a cop, no matter where you do it, that's assault, you need to pay. I agree with that. I'll raise one other interesting point on that I want your feedback on. When it comes to Sicknick, I'll agree there was a rush to blame, right, that he was killed that day and he was killed because of what happened to him and all of that. The medical examiner, you're right. I mean, he collapsed at 10 o'clock that night, died the next day. The medical examiner said no level of external or internal injuries, no chemical, whatever. But the medical examiner also testified and said that all that transpired on January 6th played a role in his condition. And again, you're right, Dinesh, that people on the left jumped to say that Sicknick was murdered that day. But I don't know how anybody can say that what happened that day didn't affect him when he collapsed at 10 o'clock that night. I mean, there's probably some connection. That's all.
I admit that. I mean, look, there's a complex issue in law as to what happens if somebody harms you and you have, let's call it, an underlying condition. Like if, for example, if I were to come to you and we decide to spar with each other and I hit you in the head, but I don't know that you have a very thin skull. And so you get a hemorrhage, which you wouldn't normally have gotten, but you have a very thin skull. You can then, but see, then the question becomes, is Dinesh guilty of inflicting serious bodily injury? And it's very questionable, because I had no idea. I wouldn't have sparred with you if I'd known you were essentially fragile in that way. So here's the point. You got cops. They sign up for a job which is stressful. I mean, whether it's dealing with a left-wing or a right-wing protest, whether it's even approaching somebody when you pull them over on the highway, these are high-stress positions. And cops, that goes with
and that was an unusually stressful day, right? You and I can acknowledge that Brian Sicknick he's never had something like that transpire. I mean, we can imagine that. That might have been the most stressful day he's ever had.
I mean, when you say we can imagine that, it could be that Brian Sicknick has been in police situations where someone pulls a gun on him. That's a far more dangerous encounter than being pepper sprayed. The other question, Joe, is, and this is something that we now know a lot more about, and that is the peculiar. You've got a giant demonstration coming to Washington. Everybody knows about.
Wait! Don't go there yet, because you and I want you to go. But remember, Dinesh, I want you to go there because that is an interesting topic, and I'm with you on that. And I'm going to get into that. Like, my God, why were we not prepared for this? Completely agree. And that's an important issue. And the January 6th committee, Dinesh, should have explored that more.
Joe, here's the thing. Let me just say this. They did. But that part of it was completely suppressed by Liz Cheney. So in other words, Liz Cheney wanted this to be anti-Trump all the way. And she wanted to be back the blue all the way. The cops are the good guys. Trump is the bad guy. So this is really how the committee ends up ideologizing their narrative.
But even Dinesh, before you get into the committee, I want to make sure maybe we are on the same page on this. and push back if we're not. Over 1,000 people have been arrested, some more seriously, some just for entering and remaining in restricted grounds, the Capitol, all the way up to assaulting police officers and criminally obstructing an official proceeding. Over 1,000 have been arrested. They're still going after folks. It could get up to 2,000. You believe, even if you can understand why they were there, you concur that people needed to be arrested for what they did.
Yes, all that we're talking about here, Joe, is this. The people who are nonviolent, which is the vast, vast majority that went into the Capitol, should be prosecuted for a misdemeanor. Now, when you're prosecuted for a misdemeanor, nobody puts you in prison for 30 days, 90 days, 6 months, or a year awaiting trial. But even though you have nonviolent people in the Capitol, not accused of any violent act, whatever, the government has gone to judges and said that precisely because they were quoted in insurrection, they pose a clear and present danger to the community and they need to be incarcerated until trial. That's absurd. The idea of a protester going in the Capitol, let's just say it was you or me, right? And let's just say we had a completely justified cause. Joe Biden, I just saw in a video talking about how he went into the Capitol, obviously many years ago, and he basically says, I was arrested, and the next day I was like joking about it. So what I'm getting at is we are in the Capitol, but we are law-abiding guys. We've never done anything like this before. You shouldn't be there, so you should be held accountable with a misdemeanor. We're talking here about the over-prosecution, the unselective punishment, the heavily biased juries. I would feel a lot better if these January 6 defendants had been granted their demands or their requests, that their trials be held in their own home districts, where they actually have a jury of their peers, as opposed to having a bunch of essentially, government bureaucrats, all of whom think alike and are all Bidenites sitting in a judgment. I mean, this is like a bunch of blacks having an all-white jury.
Dinesh, so let me address your over-prosecution. You've raised that 2 or 3 times, and I think it's an important point. Let me just quickly, Joe, though, just recite the facts so we're clear. Over 1,000 people have been arrested. Over 350 people were arrested for assaulting police officers. Over 120 people were arrested for assaulting police officers with deadly weapons. Over 100 people were arrested for criminally obstructing an official proceeding. And you're right. Then a bunch of people were arrested for breaking into the Capitol and remaining in the Capitol. But it wasn't just grandmas in the Capitol not knowing what they're doing when you really look at the numbers. Now, the over-prosecution, Dinesh, and tell me if you disagree with this. You and I can talk about riots, the riots in Minneapolis, the riots that always happen all over the country when something happens, the riots on the left, the riots on the right. I get it. What has always made this unique to me, Dinesh, is that people rioted to overthrow an election or to stop an election or to do whatever. Like this was an attack on our electoral process, i.e. our democracy. I think that's uniquely bad. What's your thought on that?
So let's establish a little bit of context. I agree with you that it is abnormal to challenge an election among Republicans. By the way, it's not abnormal to challenge an election among Democrats. In fact,
but I love you, my
on.
friend. No, but I love you, and you're good at that. But Democrats have never done this.
No, I agree. That's why I said context. By context, what I mean is we can go back to, Bush Gore 2000, Bush Kerry, fast forward to the Trump election of 2016. My point is that Democrats have frequently called elections illegitimate. They referred, as you know, for 4 years to Trump as an illegitimate president. So we can't act as if this is something really shocking. It is shocking for Republicans because Republicans, as you know, even if they lose, they normally dust themselves off and they go, let's better luck next time. So it actually takes a lot for Republicans to challenge an electoral process. In fact, I cannot, in my adult lifetime, I've never seen it before. This is the first time. Okay?
But to that point, Dinesh, yes, every time one side loses, like in 2016, Democrats are upset and they'll say, Trump's not my president. 2020 was different, though. We've never gone here where the losing president refused to accept the results. I mean, Hillary accepted the results. Hillary the next day conceded. Hillary showed up at Trump's inauguration, participated in the peaceful transfer of power. What makes 2020 so devastating and different is Trump, the guy who lost, refused to accept it, and that filtered down to his followers.
Right, and that is true, but now you have to ask, why this sort of departure of behavior, right? In other words, you say Trump refused to accept it, then let's look at why he might have felt that way. Number one, he sees that in a post-COVID environment, or in a COVID environment, pretty much all the rules governing the election, the way we've done elections, as far back as we can remember, are now changed. So we start off with the fact that it's almost like you show up for Wimbledon and now you're suddenly told it's going to be 3 sets instead of 5. The sets are going to be on a score of 10. What's happened is that this guy, Mark Zuckerberg, has put $500 million toward the referees, his 12 children's college funds. And so as a result, the referee agreed to let Zuckerberg have a whole bunch of people sit in the booth where they look at all the close calls and they decide whether the ball is in or out. And then right before the election, a bombshells, account appears. I'm talking here, of course, about the Hunter Biden story. And there is literally a nationwide media conspiracy to suppress it. I mean, just look at those factors right there. And then tell me, if Trump had made an abnormal accusation in a normal environment, I think it would be unacceptable. But Trump made an abnormal accusation in a manifestly abnormal environment.
So, my friend, you've segued perfectly into the second topic right now, which is, do you, Dinesh D'Souza, believe that the 2020 election, as Trump and many, many Republicans still do, was in fact stolen?
Yes, I think it was. But I think it was stolen in complex ways, which, and I would want to make some immediate qualifications. First of all, when it first occurred, I was on board. I just begun a podcast in January of 2021.
Hey, Dinesh, say that again. When what occurred?
When the election occurred.
Oh, okay.
I'm talking
Go
about
ahead.
The 2020 election. In the immediate aftermath, I did a lot of comments and tweets and so on to the effect that there were a lot of very bizarre anomalies around the election. But I did not conclude, I never joined in with Sidney Powell or with even Lindell to say the election was stolen. I was just anomalies. An anomaly is something bizarre, but it could have a rational explanation. And so once we began to move away from the election, I dropped the topic. And I dropped the topic for the obvious reason that when there's no proof, you can continue to harbor your suspicions. It's kind of like if you say, you know what, I think I'm missing my Rolex. I think the maid probably took it, but, I can't accuse her. I don't know if she took it. So you know what? I'm just going to go save some money and go get a new one. That was my view. So I didn't say a word about it. It wasn't, you have to fast forward almost a year and a quarter, and then I came across Through the Vote, some of the new evidence that they showed me, which had nothing to do with suitcases in Fulton County. It had nothing to do with Sidney Powell's so-called affidavits. It was evidence of a different caliber. We can go into it if you want, or we don't have to. But it was only then that I came to the view that, you know what? Quite apart from the Zuckerberg intervention, quite apart from the manipulation of the rules, quite apart from all the sort of consent decrees, quite apart from the suppression of the Hunter Biden story, there was, in fact, in at least the critical swing areas, an organized effort to tip the election for Biden.
Dinesh, that's helpful. I didn't know that distinction about you. And I think we can maybe disagree on this, but we're in the middle of a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. Many states changed their voting rules to make sure people could vote Generally, I think that's a good thing. This was done in Republican states and Democratic states. It was done by legislatures, and it was just done unilaterally by governors or secretaries of states in states where they could do that, Republican and Democrat. So states did change their rules, again, I think for a good reason. Then the election, and by the way, everybody's on the same page. Everybody's playing by the same rule book. This is going on in Republican, and Greg Abbott down in Texas unilaterally made voting easier down in Texas. It happened all over the country. The election happens, and then right away, Trump and his people start suing everywhere, and some 60 times, and every single lawsuit is thrown by the wayside of voter fraud and all the rest. So when January 6th happened, Dinesh, you didn't buy the notion that the election was stolen.
Right. I did not. Exactly.
Then a year later, that's what led you to make 2,000 Mules.
Right. Much later. It came out in May of last year. Now, so in other words, when people say to me things like the Fox host knew that the election wasn't stolen, to me, that's just a logical fallacy. Because what you're really saying is that the Fox hosts at that time, in the confusion of December, January of 2020, 2021, there was no evidence at that time. I mean, this evidence is not easy to collect.
No, but Dinesh, and I won't accuse you of this at all, but the problem with Tucker Carlson and Hannity and Laura Ingraham and the others is in real time, they said privately between the election and leading up to January 6th, this is all bullshit. It wasn't stolen. Tucker's saying one thing privately, and then they're on air telling their audience something different. That's wrong. Right?
Well, first of all, I kind of agree with you on that, but not quite for the reason you give. Here's my point. I think that, and I know these guys really well. I mean, I've known Tucker for 25 years. Laura and I went to college together at Dartmouth, and I've known Hannity for a long, long time. This is what I think was going on in their minds, if we want to be precise about it. I think that all three of them believed that the election was stolen, but that the Trump campaign and the efforts to prove it were ridiculous. So
did they believe, do you think all three, Dinesh, do you think all three believed there was voter fraud, like at that level?
Well, yes, but when I say voter fraud, let's talk about what we mean by fraud, okay? You were saying that under COVID, it's normal that the rules change and it's no big deal. And
no. I'm just saying it happened. It happened to make sure that people could vote. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I'm all in favor of making it easier to vote, but I also think it's very important to make it, when you make it easier to vote, it's equally important to make it harder to cheat. Okay, and here's why this mail-in balloting thing is a problem. And this has nothing to do with 2,000 Mules. If you or I go in to vote the old style, we walk into the booth and they give you a ballot, right? And I take my ballot and I say to the guys over there, hey, listen, guys, I got a bunch of errands. I just remembered I got to leave right now. Let me take this ballot, right? And my brother will come back later and drop it off all filled out and signed. Would they let me do it? No. Why? Because the integrity of the vote is, here's Dinesh, and we happen to know it's Dinesh, and he's in the booth. He needs to cast his vote while we're here, because who the heck knows what he's going to do once he leaves here. The shenanigans, the possibility of him, of all kinds of alterations, other people voting for him, all multiply once Dinesh leaves this building. So we are not going to let him take the ballot. But this anomaly, if you will, is normal with an absentee ballot. If I request a mail-in ballot, it comes to me. There's absolutely no supervision to make sure who signs it, who fills it out, and there's not even a very good signature checking when the ballot is sent in. Why? Because our voter rolls are bad, our signature verification is almost nil. So what I'm getting at is, it's not as if the people who are objecting to all this were trying to suppress the vote. That was the left's mantra. They're suppressing the vote. But you can't deny that while the COVID rules made it easy to vote, they made it really easy to cheat.
And is there evidence of widespread mass cheating? Hence the stolen election.
Yes.
What is that, Dinesh? What is that?
Okay. So let's begin. I won't go into this in depth, but let's just begin it this way. We're now seeing in these murder cases, the Koberger case, for example, that's in Idaho. We just saw it with the Murdaugh case. That I even saw a host on CNN, and she's going, "Yeah, I think they really got him because not only does cell phone geo-tracking place Koberger going round and round the building, he's been pinpointed." Kind of doing surveillance on the suspects before the murder. But now you notice that there's even some surveillance footage of his Hyundai Elantra. And so her point is that the combination of the cell phone evidence and the video evidence is decisive, right? And they're talking about putting a guy away for life or even possibly the death penalty based upon the combination of these two types of evidence. Well, let me just say I was laughing my head off because virtually all the fact checkers of 2000 Mules looking at the identical evidence, cell phone geo-tracking supplemented by official surveillance video whose authenticity was not even open to question, nevertheless said, cell phone geo-tracking is very unreliable. It's very imprecise. It can't possibly place a ballot mule at a drop box.
And Dinesh, just so for people who don't understand what we're talking about, Dinesh's film, 2000 Mules, the basic thesis is, correct me if I'm wrong, Dinesh, that there were these mules, which were, people hired by unnamed groups to conduct basically to stuff absentee ballots in boxes. And you track them via cell phone and geo-tracking and all the rest. And that this was done on a super large scale, that all of these mules stuffed hundreds of thousands of fraudulent ballots in boxes.
It was done on a modestly large scale, not a super large scale, because
you're talking hundreds of thousands of votes.
We're talking of hundreds of thousands of ballots, but not hundreds of thousands of mules. So we're talking about, we call the film 2000 Mules. I think, in fact, the number was larger. It was a conservative estimate. But here's the point. That all of this occurred, we only tracked them in 5 areas, not even 5 states, just greater Philadelphia, the greater Atlanta area, Detroit, Milwaukee. So what I'm getting at is if you only cheat in 5 places, you can swing the election for Joe Biden on that alone. And that's the point. The movie is not, and the movie was pointing to the need to do further investigation. So again, if you ask me, is this a legally dispositive case? I would say no. It is enough to convince a reasonable person, but it requires further investigation to seal the deal.
But yet you believe, just so I'm clear, you believe at a minimum there were 2,000 people in, say, a few battleground states who were able to stuff 400-some thousand fraudulent ballots into absentee boxes.
I would say that's just not even a matter of me believing it. I mean, we show it in the movie. We show it. You can actually see them doing it.
Right. Here's, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but like Dinesh, that's a huge, and let me finish and I'll give you the final word on this. That's a huge fucking story, if true. But my biggest problem with it is it's unproven in that no faked ballots were ever opened or inspected. None of these 2,000 some mules people have ever been questioned. And to even at that scale, 400,000 some ballots fraudulent, you'd need a falsified ballot with a unique barcode printed on special paper in a special envelope, successfully forge somebody's signature, successfully deposit that envelope, have it validated by a local official, and do this hundreds of thousands of times. And nobody in this whole scheme, Dinesh, has talked about that happening. Nobody's come forward with that story. I'll give you the final word on that.
First of all, we have a mule interviewed in the film who's talking about this operation. So we have an informant.
Not the guy in Pennsylvania.
No. This is a woman in Yuma, Arizona, and she describes the operation in Yuma. That's number one. Here's number two.
Yeah.
You can always tell. You can always tell basically who is afraid or unafraid of a truth when you're willing to push it to the next step, right? For example, if you're a scientist and you say, I believe that mixing hydrogen and oxygen is going to produce water, I'm like, so do it. And if you can't do it, we'll have a third person do it, and let's take a look and see if water comes out of it, right? Now, here's the point. When I put out 2,000 Mules, I publicly said, I am presenting a thesis here which is completely open for refutation. All that law enforcement has to do in one area, it could be in Atlanta, it could be in Milwaukee, is go and interview the mules and ask them, are you the guy who can be seen on that video dropping in all those ballots one after the other? Whose ballots were they, right? And who put you up to this? How did you get those ballots? You show up at a drop box. This is on the surveillance video. You have a satchel full of ballots. And you not only deposit a bunch, but then you go to the next drop box and the next one and the next one. So there may be an innocent explanation for your behavior. What is it? Now, isn't it telling to you that while I'm perfectly willing to have someone do that and say, Dinesh, you're wrong. There's a completely normal explanation. But don't you find it odd that on the left there was a howling, shrieking unwillingness to take that next step? Why didn't someone go, Dinesh, you know what? You're not a crazy guy. You've been in politics since your early 20s. You're making these accusations. Let's take it to the next step and show you that you're wrong. And no one wanted to do that. Why is that?
And I would respectfully say, you're not a crazy guy. This is a crazy thing, a crazy theory that I don't think has at all been proven. And if even just that, Dinesh, that there were 400,000 fraudulent votes in a few states, if there was any veracity to any of that, that's a big, huge freaking story and scandal that anybody else would have looked into. It just hasn't been proven. I'll give you the final word on this.
Because when you say things like this to someone who doesn't know, it sounds like, oh my gosh, 400,000 is a giant number. First of all, there are over 100 million votes cast in the election, okay? Number two, look at this simple fact. If you or I were to get up tomorrow and move to a different state, pretty much every authority would know about it immediately, right? We do a change of postal address. The tax people know. You move into California, immediately you get a form to pay your California taxes. You know who doesn't know? The election authorities. Nobody informs them. And so here's what happens. You move, let's just say, from Idaho to California. Your name is now on the voter rolls in Idaho. It doesn't come off. And your name is added to the voter rolls in California. Here's what I'm getting at. Americans move a lot. Think of how many Americans have just moved in the last 10 years. And now you begin to see how completely inaccurate and un-up-to-date our voter rolls are.
Agreed. And that's all got to be fixed, Dinesh. But again, you're laying down a very serious charge, and you're doing it seriously. And I respect that after a year and a half of reflection after the 2020 election, you realized that the election was stolen, and here's why. I find that utterly unconvincing. But my bigger point, Dinesh, is when Trump was screaming stolen election and all his people were screaming stolen election and all those people broke into the Capitol on January 6th, they didn't know the first thing about 2,000 mules or anything. They thought the election was stolen, and that's why they were there.
Agreed.
That's why Shaman was there.
And I also think that in that sense, their view, if they were to come ask me about it, which they never did, I would say, listen, they found it, a lot of those people found it inconceivable that Trump could lose because they felt he's the incumbent president. He's done an amazing job. The economy pre-COVID was roaring. But I would say to them, no. First of all, COVID did wreck the Trump economy. Number two, while I can see that Trump is pulling some new voters, Hispanics, he's increasing his share of the black vote, especially black males, he's also losing suburban moms. And so to me, it's not obvious if the one outnumbers the other. So I always thought that there is a way he could have lost. So that's why I think it's dogmatic to try to say, going that far back, that the election was stolen or wasn't stolen. In fact, I think part of what set me off and a lot of other people was the ridiculous assertion that this was the most secure election in American history. I don't hear that anymore. In fact, I think 2,000 Mules killed that idea, but we heard it a lot. You heard it a lot. this is the most secure election in U.S. history. So now here's my point. If anyone says that, I say to myself, wait, is there someone who has done a study of the relative amount of fraud in 2020 versus 2016, 2012, 2008, going all the way back? And is there some comparison that shows that the amount of fraud in this election was the least? I mean, common sense tells you no, because the rules were different.
But like what fraud? Like, where's the evidence of fraud? And when people say it was the most secure election in history, it was through the roof turnout in the middle of a once in a lifetime pandemic, and there weren't huge voting problems and irregularities around the country. To me, that's a pretty damn successful election in the middle of a pandemic.
But that's not what he meant. I mean, when Chris Krebs, and then echoed by Schumer and many others, said it was the most... See, notice he didn't say that this was the most wonderful election because of high participation. The most secure election means it's kind of like you say, this bank is secure. You know, no one can break into this bank because we've secured the bank. So what he meant to say, I think, was that there were so many checks in place that this was a election less vulnerable to cheating than any prior election. And I don't think that's true.
But, and again, just to put a bow on this... It's
manifestly absurd.
Yeah, just to put a bow on this, Dinesh, you respectfully can talk all you want about these mules and ballot stuffing and all the other... As of right now, you and I sitting here right now, chatting right now, still some years past the election, there is zero evidence of any voter fraud in the 2020 election. And I don't mean any. There are always isolated instances of a vote here or there. But there's zero evidence, that this election was stolen somehow through the voting process. I haven't seen it, and I don't think you have, even if you believe there could be something there.
Well, I mean, I agree with you that there has been no adequate proof that there has been voter fraud in 2020 sufficient by itself to overturn the election. And that's the standard. In other words, courts use what they call the but-for standard. Yeah. And so 2,000 Mules in that sense was an attempt to make a case for not just episodic fraud, which we all admit, but systematic fraud of a magnitude sufficient. Now, I agree that since 2,000 Mules, the Democratic areas covered in the movie, there's been no follow-up investigation. So far, the House has not done anything with this evidence, even though they conceivably could. To me, the first step in these things is always what we're doing: discussion, sunlight, public exposure. So I would welcome that. I would invite that as the first step. But yeah, I would hold back prior. If you said to me, Dinesh, are you claiming that you have the right now to go and ask Biden to leave? I would say, of course not. I'm not. That would be absurd.
Dinesh, let me throw just a few quick things at you before we finish. You tweeted about 6 or 7 days ago. Here's your tweet. You were talking about the shaman, Jacob Chansley, what do we call him? The QAnon shaman, whatever he was.
The shaman guy, I call him.
Thank you. You said Jacob Shamley is serving 41 months in prison for what? For being escorted through the Capitol by 2 police officers. He's serving in prison for no other reason than to serve a duplicitous ideological narrative about January 6th. To which Dinesh, and I know you know this, but I want you to explain it. Jacob Chansley is in jail right now because he pled guilty to criminal obstruction of an official proceeding. He testified that he crawled through a broken window. He testified that he ignored officers' demands to leave. He testified that he engaged in a 30-minute face-off with officers outside the Senate chamber. And then he testified that he left a threatening note to Mike Pence in the Senate dais. I mean, he testified to this shit. That's why he's in prison, in his own words.
Joe, have you ever seen an interview with this guy?
Are you gonna tell me? But he had legal representation too, Dinesh.
Yeah, but his lawyer was on, I think it was Tucker Carlson the second or third day, saying the footage that you, Tucker, showed, I did not have. Now think about that for a minute. You have a lawyer, you have Brady requirements in which the prosecution is obliged to disclose and reveal to the defense potentially exculpatory footage. And this lawyer, after the case is over and after the guy's already pled, then he gets the footage and he goes, oh, wow, if I had this footage. Now, this is just a desecration of law. It's a desecration of law to have a guy, because people will plead to things. This is like a cop who goes to a guy who's accused of murder and says, hey, listen, we have your DNA, even though they don't. But we've got you doing this, we got you doing that. Sign this plea over here, and we're not going to give your defense exculpatory material.
But Dinesh, and just for the record, prosecutors came out over the weekend and said that, in fact, all of that footage that was shown on Tucker Carlson's show, Chansley's lawyers had had for discovery. But even if you're right and they didn't have that 10 seconds or 20 seconds of coverage of him strolling through the Capitol, Dinesh, there's footage of everything else he did that, of course, Tucker didn't show. But there's footage of him ignoring officers' demands. There's footage of him having a face-off outside the Senate chamber. I mean, that footage is there, too.
It is. But see, Joe, this comes down, and this is maybe a good way for us to summarize where we are.
Yeah.
We're in an awkward situation because we're looking at the same event. We're like two guys having lunch in a cafe, and we see a car crash or we see a crime, and we're giving completely different accounts. Not because either of us is refusing to accept what the other person is saying, but because we're disputing to what degree this particular scene or photo or image is typical, right? So, for example, when people say, well, January 6th was basically a nonviolent walkthrough, Tucker said something to this effect, Liz Cheney tweets out the most violent video that she can find. And I admit that you could find a handful of violent videos and string them together. It looks like a violent event. On the other hand, you can string together an equally long list, if not longer, of peaceful videos and go, it was a peaceful event. So part of the problem here is proportionality.
What Tucker did a week and a half ago, 4 minutes, I mean, there's a million hours of footage out there. And you and I, Dinesh, there's hours and hours and hours of hand-to-hand combat. I mean, you and I have seen that. For Tucker to just throw out 3 or 4 minutes and say this was a picnic, a day at the beach, you would concur that that's equally dishonest, right?
Well, yes, but again, here's the problem with that argument. The January 6th committee was supposed to be an investigation. And what's normally happens in an investigation is you have members of both sides, right? You have cross-examination. You have people have a chance to bring up the opposite side of the argument. We see this with the Twitter files, right? Republicans are running the hearings, but Democrats get to ask hostile questions. And as a result, a fairly full picture emerges. The problem is this, and that is for a year and a half, we've had a relentless barrage of cherry-picked clips and one-sided ideological commentary. Now, it's against that backdrop that Tucker steps in. Tucker's stepping in to say, hey, listen, I've found some videos that you've never seen before that give a completely different picture. I'm not claiming that these 3 videos represent the 40,000 hours of footage. I'm simply saying that they're new videos, and there's a reason you haven't seen them, because people like Liz Cheney suppressed them. And the media suppressed them.
You would acknowledge that Tucker cherry-picked, even if there's a defense for why he cherry-picked.
Yes, I would agree.
I would agree with you on this. I don't think Nancy Pelosi at the very beginning ever should have bounced Jim Jordan and whoever else off of the committee. The Republicans should have been able to pick their people to be on the January 6th committee. I wish that had happened. I would defend the committee in that generally they had, thousands of witnesses and hundreds of thousands of hours. And yes, they may have had a narrative, but it generally fit with what happened that day. That would be my only distinction.
Did you see the interview with Bernie Thompson where he was asked, what did you make of the Tucker Carlson footage? And he goes, I didn't see any footage. So this guy is the chairman of the committee.
You're right. I saw that. That footage was available to the committee. All of it was available to the committee. to recap, Dinesh, and I appreciate your time. You and I both agree January 6th was a bad day. Or do
Yes.
we? Do
We
you
do
and
agree. I mean, it should not have happened. People should not go. Look, my daughter was very involved with the Trump campaign. She was on the board of Women for Trump. She spoke at a couple of the Stop the Steals rallies, but she wasn't present in January 6th. It's just, she had enough good sense not to be there, and she would have had enough good sense if she was there not to go inside the Capitol. So that is the prudent, sensible thing to do.
And you and I both agree, even if we disagree with the severity of sentencing, that people who've been arrested and charged for various offenses, they deserve to be arrested and charged. You may quibble and say some of the arrests and charges and sentencing has been too strict.
Yes, and I think the environment has been very biased as well. But yes, I would agree that people who committed misdemeanors should be charged with misdemeanors and given penalties proportional to other people who commit similar offenses. And the same is true of people who fight with cops or do anything else.
And by the way, what's interesting here as we wrap with Dinesh, you and I would disagree on whether the 2020 election was stolen. We'll table that. We disagree on that. You and I, Dinesh, even though we didn't get into it, I think we both agree that the committee also should have focused more on why the hell we weren't prepared for this. And we may disagree on, I have my own reasons for why I don't think the police and whoever wasn't ready for this, but that's an important piece here that we need to focus on more. You and I both agree on that.
Yeah, and one other thing, if I can see if you agree with this, that the pervasive regime of censorship, digital censorship, censorship across the board, which began with the 2020 election, but then expanded to include, today it includes a number of topics from climate change to the trans issue. I mean, all of this is extremely unhealthy for our democracy, because if somebody believes an election is stolen, it's bad enough that they believe that. But if you then tell them that they're not allowed to raise the issue or they will be, deplatformed, I mean, this is only going to intensify that feeling and emotion. So if this is aimed at tamping it down, it's only having the opposite effect.
Agreed. Transparency, get everything out there. And we have too many people, Dinesh, on the left and the right, not you, on the left and the right, that try to shut up speech and shut down people who they disagree with. I completely agree with that. Let me close with a personal question I always ask everybody I speak with. You are a very well-known person. You are, I'd say, I'm not going to say the word controversial. You say what you believe, and you've got people who love you and people who hate you. Dinesh D'Souza, what's one thing that you wish people understood about you?
Well, I would say that, I was 17 years old when I first came to America. I came with $500 in my pocket. I had a feeling I would not be going back home. And I came to a country where I felt that certain principles, certain basic things would be affirmed. The idea that my life mattered as an individual, the idea that I'd be treated equally under the law. America's defined by ladders of opportunity, where it doesn't matter who you are if you start life at the bottom, but you're smart, you're willing to work hard, you make your way up the rungs of the ladder. And so it is that original kind of gale force idea of America that stuck in my mind. And my politics have always been based upon defending that. So while we might disagree about affirmative action, we might disagree about woke culture, we may disagree about this or that, in the end, I'm nothing more than a guy who came to the country with nothing and has seen the American dream, not just as a dream, but as a reality play out in my life. And so that becomes the basis of what I'm, fighting for. All my provocation, my controversy, my disputes are in the end aimed at vindicating that. And I think that is a very widely shared American idea. So for this reason, I'm no extremist. I'm not even outside the mainstream. I'm certainly in the Republican mainstream. But I also don't like I don't like dishonesty. I don't like hypocrisy. I don't like posers. I don't like people who act like they're virtuous, and then the moment that they have to put up a penny, they refuse to do that. So I'm a little relentless in attacking those people. But even when I attack them, I'm doing it in a spirit where if they came up to me and went, "Hey man, you know what?" I'm like, "Okay, fine." So
do you attack people?
Behind it.
Do you attack people on the right who exhibit that as well?
I would. It's not that I'm unwilling to do that. So, for example, I mean, my objection to Tucker Carlson and Vox is just this. It's different than yours. It is that I think that they shut down the coverage of a really important issue. Now, Tucker may have cherry-picked the first few videos, but I think they should release the videos to the public. Why? Now, a lot of people will cherry-pick, but that's okay. Why? Because, again, like in a judicial proceeding, the prosecution makes its case and it cherry-picks. And the defense makes its case and it cherry-picks. And the jury gets, which is the American people in this case, are able to observe back and forth, and they go, you know what? I think this is the truth of the matter. And in the same way that juries decide that, we decide that in terms of public opinion.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that, Dinesh, January 6th is probably there's probably more footage of January 6th than any other criminal activity or act of terror, whatever you want to call it. I mean, there's been so much footage out there of everything. I think generally, some people can't accept what it was, but people generally kind of know what happened. What I find fascinating is you're a man of the right. I consider myself to be a principled man of the right. You're a principled man of the right. You and I are kind of on opposite sides now because of a lot of the political shit that's going on. We can have that conversation another day. I just think it's really important for two people like you and I to sit down. We fundamentally disagree on the 2020 election and disagree on most of January 6th. But damn it, Dinesh, thank you. This was a good, respectful, interesting conversation, my friend.
I expected no less, and I'm delighted to have been part of it. Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, by the way, everybody, Dinesh D'Souza's podcast, check it out. It's a great podcast he's got out there. Follow Dinesh on Twitter. Dinesh, thank you, my friend.
A pleasure.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.